Okay, we're going to get started. I assume some people will continue to trickle in, but thank you all for joining us. I'm Joanna Weiss. I'm the co-founder and co-executive director of the Justice Center, and we are delighted to have Josh Page and Joe Soss here talking about the book, Legal Plunder, the Predatory Dimensions of Criminal Justice. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. There is a Q&A function that you can access through the Zoom. We won't be using the chat function, just the Q&A function. So if you have any questions, please put them there. And also there are captions available for anyone who is having any trouble hearing us, but hopefully the sound will carry and work for everyone. I just would love to welcome Joe and Josh and just ask you guys to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how you came to this work.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having us, and thanks for the folks that are here and online. It's a real honor. Joe and I have engaged with the Fines Peace Justice Center for many years and learned a great deal. As you read the book, you'll see them throughout the book. Yes, I'm Josh Page. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota. I've been studying issues related to the criminal legal system for my whole career. I got into this work when I was a graduate student. I was a volunteer teaching instructor at San Quentin Prison, and that's what sort of led me down this path. I didn't go to graduate school to study these issues, but it was through that experience. And after that, I did my dissertation, and my first book was on the California Prison Officers Union and victims' rights groups and the politics around punishment and mass incarceration. And I sort of stayed in that area more or less throughout my career, trying to understand how and why criminal legal policies and practices change and don't change. And I've also been very interested in people that work in the system on the front lines of the criminal legal system. So whether at first it was prison officers, and then I got really interested in the bail bond industry. There was very little research done, but there's this industry and the pretrial process that's incredibly important and very understudied. And so several years ago, I actually got a job as a bail bond agent and studied it from the inside, trying to understand how it works, why it works like it does, and the consequences of that. And it was actually through that research that brought me into this field that I can talk a little bit about as we get going.
Hi, I'm Joe Soss, and I want to say thank you to Joanna Weiss and FFJC for having us here. We actually rely heavily on some of the work that they've done in the book, and I believe that Joanna's the final quote of anyone in the book is Joanna Weiss. And I also want to thank Estrella, who managed to get us here when we went to NYU Law School instead of our law school. My path to this work is a little more winding than Josh's. Started out by dropping out of law school. And then becoming a political scientist instead of a sociologist, because political science said I didn't have to take the GRE, which I was very grateful for. And when I went to grad school for political science, I learned what a lot of people learn about poor and marginalized populations, which is what they lack, that they had lower levels of political knowledge, lower levels of political participation, lower all the way. And this struck me as very strange, given that people who were in many ways in the most subjugated groups along lines of class and race and gender, sometimes had the most intense relationships with the state. And I became interested in that question and pursued it initially in a study that with my dissertation became my first book that was based on the experiences of welfare recipients, people participating in welfare programs as a political experience, studying their claims making as a form of political action, studying their relationships with welfare agencies as places where rights and obligations had real meaning on the ground in ways that they didn't for many privileged Americans, and then what they learned and what they took away and how it shaped their citizenship and their political action, all that. And after that, that project, I got interested in why things were designed so differently in different programs. I was studying that in the cash welfare program, it was now TANF, and Social Security Disability Insurance. And I was sort of like, well, these are totally different experiences, and I analyzed how that worked. But I wanted to get on the other side of things. And so I started studying how these programs were shaped by politics and all of that, disciplining the poor and other works. And eventually I began to grapple with the fact that this question of sort of how the problems of populations associated with poverty and at the bottom of the social order are governed, the sort of rising importance that I've been living through of criminal legal governance, policing and punishment, adjudication, and that sort of thing. And we dealt with that some in that last book, Disciplining the Poor, but I really began to move in that direction at that point. And it was at that point that Josh and I began to have some more serious conversations after teaching a course together, and doing some other little writing projects.
The Wire.
Yeah, we wrote a chapter about the Wire and the war on drugs. And at that point, we really began to turn to this project, particularly right after Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson, Missouri, and an uprising that resulted from that. Really pushed the Department of Justice into doing this in-depth investigation that sort of revealed to the world this predatory form of government in many ways. And we began to talk at that point about studying this on a larger scale.
Well, this does feel like a really full circle moment because we've been relying on you and talking to you for many, many years. So I'm really delighted that we can have this conversation today. We're going to focus a lot on the fines and fees portions of the book, although I think it will just touch on some of the other areas of predation that you talk about in the book. But can you start out telling us a little bit about some of your findings about the history of predatory behaviors and predation in the criminal legal system? And specifically, can you talk about the historical and political roots of using the criminal legal system as a predatory tool?
Yeah, that's sure. So, part of this book is to understand at the sort of, most straightforward level, this huge complex of practices that begins to rise in the 80s and 90s to the present and comes to reach every corner of criminal legal governance, of practices that essentially extract resources from poor communities, disproportionately from poor communities of color, and turn them into public revenues and private profits in various ways, oftentimes through public-private partnerships. These practices are disparate. They've oftentimes been studied in small subsections with different kinds of theoretical framings. All of that work is the reason we're able to write this book. We're greatly indebted to it. We hope this is a productive complement to that work. But what we're trying to do is bring those things together into a common frame of analysis and understand that. Part of the reason why we refer to this as predation, we'll talk about this a little bit more going forward, but is that we want to sort of understand this development, not as something that just happened on its own, but is really a development in the historical evolution, a sort of blend of historical change and continuity that really runs back to even the colonial era, prior to the founding of the country, and to connect it to what we would call the country's foundational predatory projects of Black enslavement and Native dispossession, in which conquest and various forms of violence and containment in many ways were bound up with policing, with criminalization, with adjudication and punishment in various ways that advanced these projects. And this is an important part of it. Advance these projects that were not like something that was the opposite of or a violation of this emerging liberal political economy, but actually subsidized it all the way and was very central to state building, very central to the emergence of our legal system, very central to the emergence of American capitalism, right? And to understand that connection with criminal legal governance and how, in many ways, liberal political economy and predatory projects have always been entwined. And then after the Civil War, to look at this sort of movement where predatory projects begin to move much more in terms of balance, not that they hadn't been there before, but the balance begins to move inside criminal legal operations, and particularly penal labor, right? And you begin to get the era of prison industries, of convict leasing, of penal farms, of chain gangs, all of these sorts of things. And for a very long time, labor centered on the convicted individual, right, is at the center of the system. And then starting about the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 90s, we begin to enter this era that's really at the heart of this book and our analysis, which is an era in which there's a financialization of these predatory projects, a considerable shift. Labor extraction actually goes down a bit in terms of its frequency and in the experience of convicted and imprisoned individuals, but it remains important, particularly in community supervision context. But there's this explosion of financial means of extraction that rely on financial charges, the imposition of debts, collections, various sorts of mechanisms. And this, and I'll sort of end here, really involves three kinds of expansion. So predation not only shifts, the shifts allows for a kind of expansion of predation as a whole. These extractive operations. One is, if you think about it, the extraction of labor from the convicted individual is simply something that can be done to the individual. You need to have the individual, you need to have convicted them, you then put them to work, they do the work. Financialization allows this to expand into the entire community, so that resources are being taken not just from the person you control, they become an anchor for really, these are not collateral consequences, these are the primary targets of extraction, are the people who have the resources out in the community in many cases, right? Even though the individual is the person who has the debt imposed, et cetera, right? The second thing is, you can add fees and fines and all kinds of financial elements anywhere in the system, not just at the point of control with incarceration or release or community supervision. And so suddenly the pretrial process becomes overrun with, this is not, someone's not being convicted and punished, but it becomes overrun with these sorts of various ways of taking money. The bail industry, you get privatization, which oftentimes the way for privatization is partly paved by governments demonstrating that you can impose these prices everywhere. And suddenly you get private interest saying, hey, we'd like in on that action in some way. So you get that spread. And then the third element of sort of expansion is that unlike labor, right, you can actually expand financial takings, which is, financial resources is by definition something that poor communities lack. You can expand it temporally into the future by creating debts, right? And so along all three of these dimensions, you get this really dramatic expansion in the scale and scope of takings.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was very interesting in your discussion of shifting from labor to financialization was some of the pushback that was coming from poor white communities as a result of using incarcerated people for their labor and extracting resources from them through their labor. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the pushback happened and how that moved towards financialization?
Prison labor. Yeah, I mean, so prison labor around the Gilded Age, so was quite profitable and quite extensive. And a lot of the opposition to prison labor came through unions, came through laborers, because they would undercut the wage of people on the free market. They would stigmatize free workers and so forth. So some of the push, some of it was from progressive reformers, from religious groups, but a lot of it was from unions that led to some of the laws that really curtailed prison labor, at least the private forms of prison labor. But then prison labor never went away. It moved much more to some call like prison housekeeping. It's the upkeep of the institution, right? And that's continued all along and still continues to this day. So our argument is not that labor has gone away. It's just that we're thinking of a balance between labor extraction and financial extraction. The balance has changed, but also they often work together, right? If you think of prison labor exploitation and the very low wages people make, right? Very, very low. Which that does is then it requires people to, if they want to get better food, prison food is, people don't get enough to eat and they don't get healthy food, they don't get good food, and they want to get extra food. They can't pay for it because of their wages, because of this super exploitation behind bars. And so they have to rely on people in the community. And the people in the community then put money on the books of people to be able to go to the commissary. Well, those companies then charge, if you put $50 on someone's book, you're going to pay $6 in fees or something like that. And then when they put money on the books, Some prisons will then take a portion of that to fund pay to stay fees and restitution and so forth. And so in many cases, we see that it's not they're not separate. They're actually often work together when you start actually looking at the practices and how they actually operate on the ground.
Yeah. I'm just gonna back up for a minute because I feel like we talk about fines and fees together all the time, but could you talk about how you distinguish between a fine and a fee? And can you also talk about what makes fines and fees predatory as opposed to just a form of punishment?
Sure.
So the question of what makes something predatory is for us sort of the more paramount question than necessarily exactly where you draw the line between fines and fees. I think it can be very difficult to distinguish between fines and fees at times. Some fees are added in a way that they function very much like fines. Some fines are added in ways that they're not distinguishable from a fee. They're just simply an additional cost put on. And so that distinction, though it may be very important in many legal contexts and may have a lot of ramifications for our analysis, is less central. The question of what's predatory is very central. And so let me explain a little bit what we don't mean and what we do mean by that. First of all, by using the language predatory, this is not, first and foremost, as sort of pejorative label for certain types of actors, although people are free to come to their own judgments about the actors involved. The fact is, empirically, many different kinds of actors are involved in this work who do many other things as well. It's also not a claim about their motives, that they set out to prey on someone. People are engaged in these actions for a variety of reasons. For example, judges have frequently complained about basically running extractive operations that partly self-fund their courts. But the injustices that they would confront if they had insufficient funding for their basic operations, the delays in people's trials, the administrative problems, all of these things strike them as bigger injustices in some ways. They may, there are a lot of motives at work, right? People trying to keep the lights on in some cases in their agencies. So it's not a claim about motives, it's not a claim about types of people. It's also not a claim about outcomes, right? If I could make a metaphor or sort of analogy with exploitative labor relations. Exploitative labor relations aren't always profitable. Sometimes businesses do very well. Sometimes they go out of business. But they may both have exploitative labor relations. It's about relations. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about predatory relations. The last thing that I'll get to is this. Fines are not predatory. Fees are not predatory. They can be put to predatory uses or not. You can't look at a fine in its essence and find out whether in some way it is a predatory being or thing. In some way, it's a question of how it's used. So then if it's about relations and the practices that constitute and enact them, like what is that about? Well, the key concept here is predatory inclusion, right? And usually when we talk about inequalities, we talk about exclusions. This is the primary way that we talk about it in liberal discourse. It's the primary way that we tend to talk about it in legal discourses. It's the primary way in which people who study punishment in society have talked about it. So the mark of a felony record, for example, infamously, right, makes it harder for one to rent a place to live, to get a job, to do all sorts of things. People are excluded from good jobs, maybe having nothing to do with the criminal legal system per se, but for reasons of race or gender or whatever it might be. People are excluded from lots of things than other people. From the perspective of predatory inclusion and from the perspective of our analysis, that's half of the story. It's extremely important. It's critical to understanding how inequality works. But the other half of the story is that people are enriched and people are impoverished by a second dynamic, which is that when you are excluded from one thing, you become oftentimes a ripe target for inclusion into predatory relations and practices. So that the person who is unable to participate in the primary market for loans, right, and for banking, becomes a right target for payday lenders and pawn shop lenders and check cashing operations, all kinds of predatory operations that exploit the fact and long have done this, particularly in race and class segregated neighborhoods, in housing markets and all sorts of things where people are basically paying an extra tax almost. They're being subject to usurious lending practices also because they can. Why? Because the first move, the subjugation, the exclusion, the marginalization, produces them as targets, right, for the second operation. And you have to understand how the two operate together. And so here, what we're talking about is the fine might be used, you might fine a billionaire, you might fine a polluting corporation, right? You might impose fees for government in a way that's not predatory at all. When it becomes predatory is when it follows the lines of social structure of dominant subordinate groups, right? It exploits, it uses the subjugation, exclusion, marginalization of a group they leverages that in order to establish a set of relations and practices that then intensively exploit that group beyond what others experience or expropriate from that group, take from them in some way. So what's going on here with fines and fees that we're talking about is the use of them in these projects, the incorporation of them. So when we think of prison as a place where people are warehoused and excluded, right? It's possible to understand, for example, the idea of fees imposed on them as an additional punishment that was not sanctioned by the court. But another way to understand it, that's also productive, we would argue, and very important, is to understand that their sequestering in this space has positioned them as a kind of holding, an asset that the state can sell monopoly rights of exploitation to a company to come in and do that and then receive commissions back for that through a partnership, that it positions them in ways that they can have pay to stay fees imposed on them. They can have all these things get done in this dual movement that I've described, right? On the one hand, in the enclosure, the separation, subjugation, control, all of that being then leveraged to extract. And that's what makes those fees predatory, not the fact that they're simply fees.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and things can be predatory and still desirable and still very much appreciated by those who are being extracted from, right? And so, because what positions people, as Joe's talking about, is they have needs, vulnerabilities, and desires, right? Whether it be to get out of jail, as in bail, whether it be to connect with a loved one, right? And so, when I was working as a bail bond agent, people were often very grateful to have used the services of a bail bond agent because they had no other choice to get out of jail, even though they're paying a 10% premium that they'll never get back and they'd have no choice to do it, but they're very grateful. People are very grateful often to be able to use the phone in a prison, right? To be able to connect, even if the family is paying large rates. People are very grateful to have tablets. They have to pay a bunch of fees and so forth, right? But that's because they've been excluded from other arrangements, right? Whereas if I get arrested, Joe can go put the money down with the court, get that money back, and he's not losing that money, right? But if you're too broke to do that, and 80% of criminal defendants are indigent enough to qualify for a public defender, you're positioned in a way you're excluded from being able to do that, so you have to use the bail bond agent. And so you can be very grateful from it. So it can seem like a tension or a contradiction, but we don't see it that way. Is that this can still be operating in a predatory way, and people can still be very grateful and be very fearful if these things are being threatened and taken away, right? And so, like, when we're thinking about what should be done, it's not necessarily get rid of the tablets, it's not get rid of the phone calls. It's like, what are the terms on which they operate, and are they just or unjust?
And just to sort of connect those two, this is why keeping both sides of this two-sided dynamic in mind is so important, because this works, because something people desperately need or want or whatever it is being denied to them in the first step. And then it's being offered only under conditions of predatory practices and relations in the second step. And so it's hardly surprising that we find that they fear losing it in that second step. The whole reason the predation is possible is precisely because it's so important to them. It's whether it's phone calls in prisons or it's check cashing operations in neighborhoods.
So you talked about the history of predatory behaviors within the criminal justice system, descending from the original sin, from slavery and through Jim Crow. Why are fines and fees disproportionately impacting communities of color today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's, you know, for the same reasons that people who are disproportionately involved in the criminal legal system are poor communities of color, right? Though I know that more and more poor white people are, I've seen some of the graphs lately of the prison population, and it's really starting, the conventional story around race and so forth is getting much more complicated, but we know historically and even today, where the concept, you know, how policing is arranged around, you know, structural conditions that contribute to crime and so forth, prosecution and so forth. And so I think it's, you know, I don't necessarily think it's a separate, you know, reason why they're disproportionately involved in fines and fees, but also it's because, you know, it's also, it has to do when it comes to like police, you know, we learned from Ferguson and then the other studies around is that, right, part of this process we're talking about is also spatial and social exclusion or inclusion in particular areas, right, that stem from, you know, from the Great Migration and so forth, is that you know, that certain communities are targeted specifically for fines and fees for civil asset forfeiture too, right? We talk about asset forfeiture a lot in the book, and the popular story about asset forfeiture is it's going after kingpins, it's going after terrorist organizations, right? But the research in places like Philadelphia and other cities shows it's actually most of the money is brought in by a lot of forfeitures of quite a small amounts of money that are concentrated in race class subjugated communities. And so, yeah, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a little bit, because I think that I was talking about how there's books or works at these different levels, and that's sort of the closer to the criminal legal level. And just to step back and talk about the importance of racial capitalism to all of this, right? That part of the you know, might call it really intersectional capitalism, but part of what the book is trying to understand how various operations sort of rely on these intersecting axes of power and hierarchy in society, and the way people are positioned differently in the political economy as a result of this. So we have to ask the question of why is it that the subprime loans that wound up leading up to the Great Recession and the Great Financial Crisis were so concentrated in these same neighborhoods? We have to ask why the check cashing operations and the pawn shop lenders and all these other predatory operations are also concentrated in these areas. And it's precisely because of this two-step movement of predatory inclusion. This is where people have been excluded. This is where people, and so when we look at this is where people have been over policed, underprotected, and pulled into, right, our policing, court, and penal operations. You know, they're the ones where the structure has been created, right, in that first step, and they're subjected to more intense versions. That said, once you know, when I used to study welfare primarily, we used to say if you want to understand racism and its relationship to the welfare state, one of the most limiting ways to do that is to start with the disparities frame, where you simply say, what's the difference between how people who are deemed to be white and people who are deemed to be black or deemed to be, well, whatever group, right? How they're treated, because the whole system has been shaped by racism. The whole system has been shaped by racial politics in all sorts of ways, racial discourses and racial attacks. And so in many ways, when we look today, it's important to remember, it's not just about at what rate, right, are different groups subjected to these sorts of predatory practices and how much money's taken. It's partly about the politics of how the whole system has been created. And it's about where the epicenter is. You can easily find that people have studied middle class black neighborhoods, say, that have very considerable operations. You can find poor white areas. What you find is that people who are disadvantaged along certain axes, right, of power and inequality in society, whether you're at the low end of those, and especially as you get toward the combinations, the intersections of those things, you come closer and closer to central targets.
What do you see as the most lasting and harmful impacts of using fines and fees as a predatory tool?
Well, so I think there's a lot of great research that shows the negative impacts on individuals. And something we're trying to do in this work is we're really focusing on the level of the community, right? And whether it be fines and fees, whether it be bail or so forth, it incorporates whole families and whole communities, right? And so it drains wealth from the family level that affects children, it affects evictions and so forth. It can also drain lots of resources from whole communities. And one of the things I found, one of the sort of key findings I found in my bail research that then became really insightful for us is just like that while bail is focused, I would say, on the defendants, right, who are disproportionately male, the people that are paying the bails disproportionately are women, right? Their mothers, their grandmothers, and so forth. And then as they pay, they have less money to pay for medicine, pay for childcare. So it's affecting, and we see similar dynamics, right? Whether it be paying to care for those who are in prison through all the money that goes through phone calls, that goes to the commissary, and so forth. And so I think it's important to think about the way that this all I'll use the term cascading, the way they cascade out. And the person who is legally entangled, in many ways, is an anchor. And it's a way to tap into the family, tap into the community. And this is part of what Joe was talking about, the way that financialization allows for the expansion of this. And so I think, what we're talking to us, this is about, it's not just a criminal justice issue. This is a racial justice issue. This is an economic justice issue. This is a gender justice issue.
Yeah, and I will say that the research on the fines and fees side mirrors exactly what you're describing. Bail side, which is that about 80% of the fines and fees are paid by women. It is mostly by loved ones of the person who is actually facing charges or conviction. It is their mothers, their sisters, their wives, their girlfriends, their family members, loved ones, disproportionately women of color who are paying. Absolutely.
I just want to sort of lift it up a little bit too, so if we start with the communities, I think that's shared with a number of other ways in which these practices are studied as different aspects of what we do. What I would say, one of the things about a predatory framework for understanding this is the way in which it sort of calls on us to bring the dominant groups into the same frame of analysis as the subordinating groups. And to bring their agency, bring the actors in to connect low finance to high finance, the low finance of all of these predatory legal practices, to bring into the frame that all of these companies that are engaged in prison profiteering, telecom and commissary, that they're substantially owned at this point by private equity at the top, that the money is flowing through, in many cases, the mom and pop bail bond shops up to a small number of huge insurance companies. That this is a massive redistribution from those who have the least to those who have the most in many cases. And to understand that this is subsidizing communities that are oftentimes portrayed as draining, in a sense, the public wealth and public stores of resources are actually subsidizing in many cases operations that are benefiting much more privileged Americans who are scarcely aware that these practices are happening. And so when we talk about damage, I don't want us to lose sight of the societal question of the injustices that we're all living in, and that, what it would mean to have a truly just society, the implications for care, and the implications for democracy. Right, and the kinds of relations, to go back to something I said at the very beginning of where I started in this, how are individuals positioned in relation to the state, right? How do they experience power? What does it mean to be targeted for plunder under the banner of law and justice by your own government, right? And its corporate partners, to understand what we're constructing here and how far it is from the stated ideals of law. What are the corrupting effects for impartiality in courts when you have courts needing to self-fund to a significant degree? How are police carried even further away from public safety missions in the neighborhoods that they're targeting most for these kinds of plundering applications. So across the board, there's a wide variety of things aside from the extraction itself that we can think of as societal harms, and nowhere more than the
One of the things that I thought was interesting that you brought to this, I think we can see some of the societal harms of repurposing all these different justice system players, from judges, prosecutors, and public defenders, and police, and repurposing them as being part of this system to generate revenue. You also talk in the book a little bit about the civil court system and how that's being leveraged into this. Can you talk a little bit about that? I found that really interesting because we think of this as a problem within the criminal system, but it's actually creeping out beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, so we, when we're thinking about, going back to this historical study, right? I mean, there's different ways to think about the criminal legal system, and predation, right? And when we think about the history, we talk about criminal legal systems as in support of enabling predatory projects, slavery, native dispossession, so forth. And then we talk about them as being sites of predation, right? And so when we're talking about the contemporary period, to think about, we're also thinking about the way that, on the one hand, the criminal legal system is used to support debt, to support extraction through renting, and through landlords, and through these other kinds of processes, whether it be bringing in prosecutors to push people to pay down their debt, or bringing in law enforcement to help with the evictions. There's this supportive element too, but also using civil law to support to try to collect on the debts that are produced through the criminal legal system, right? Through contempt orders and all these other kind of things. So we're thinking about, we don't think of it as just a criminal legal. We're thinking about the relations between civil law, criminal law, and the way they sort of work together and support each other in different ways.
Yeah, I want to make sure that we get to take some
Sure.
questions from the audience. I just want to move us a little bit towards solutions. And you lift up some of FFJC's campaigns for reform in the book, including Free to Drive, which is our national campaign to end debt driver's license suspensions. You talk about End Justice Fees, which is our campaign to eliminate fees in the criminal legal system. You talk about the other campaigns that are happening around the country, connecting families to make all communications with people who are incarcerated free of charge, debt-free justice to make juvenile fines and fees eliminated. What are some of the commonalities that you see in these approaches to reform? Or if they're different, what are some of the lessons that you took away from these various campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we found so inspiring really is the formation of these large networks that your organization and others are sort of at the center of, that are bringing together research outfits, directly impacted communities, legislator, all these different groups together in these networks and sharing resources, like literally like strategies, but also being able to move at different levels of government, right? Because this action happens at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. So having these nimble networks of bringing together all these different resources, not just financial, but know-how, intellectual, being able to tap into different, we found really inspiring. And so it's more than just coalitions, it's these broad-based networks that also allows to address the problem in what we sort of a conjunctural way, right? It's like not having a one-size-fit-all approach, is that, here it makes much more sense to go in a legal route. Here it makes much more sense to go in a legislative route. Here it means, backing a certain prosecutor for elect, right? It's bringing together people that can help us sort of understand the situation at the different levels and to target it appropriately rather than having this sort of one size fits all kind of approach to it. I mean, so that was one of the things that we found And we've been lucky enough to be in some of these sort of conferences that are organized or paid for by like Arnold Ventures and so forth. And seeing all these people together and hearing the brainstorming and the sharing of resources is just really inspirational. I think that commitment to not going it alone, not just sort of saying, we're going to do our chunk, you stay in your lane, but coming together, I think has been one of the reasons this book is, somebody was saying earlier, on the one hand, it's really depressing, right? It's a story of deep injustice, right? But honestly, as we're researching the book, it was deeply inspiring. We lay out a lot of the barriers. These are really significant barriers to change. And there's been a lot of amazing victories and really amazing infrastructure laid down that still now so through that. So that's some of the stuff that just sort of immediately popped up to us was like, oh yeah, this is really working.
I'll add a little bit to that just in saying, I mentioned earlier, I came from welfare studies in many ways. And in that, of course, I always worked with activists and advocacy groups, but it was, harm reduction and it was fighting the fight. There was no expectation that Democrats were going to be willing to touch this issue, and Republicans were mostly interested in it for electoral gain, as something to sort of beat Democrats over the head with in many ways. What makes this in many ways I have so much more optimism in this area, and so does Josh, I think, is that people are winning in state and local arenas in particular around the country, victories that we wouldn't necessarily expect. And one of the things that really struck us in analyzing this was not only the fact that, of course, there are so many disadvantages, political, disadvantages that the groups who are most heavily targeted have in US politics, but also that the people who are fighting on the other side are oftentimes very well resourced repeat players who are coming into a local, whether it's a local election or policy dispute, with the op-eds written, veterans of political campaigns fighting this exact same issue. They're doing it over and over again. And so when we talk about the importance of networks, part of it is that oftentimes state and local advocates and activists are in the position of having to reinvent the wheel and do this work. And so things like FFJC and other organizations that are doing this work to sort of inform different places and to say, oh, if you're working on this kind of issue, here's a set of arguments that worked in this other places, whether it's legal arguments in a courtroom or it's arguments that were advanced for the public or for policymakers, whatever it is. That sort of sharing is necessary to counter that to some degree. And it's really important to coordinate in these local ways where you say, okay, we need to elect someone because we need the person who's going to make the ultimate decision to be this kind of person, not that kind of person. But we also need to put pressure on them. And we also need to work through the courts to get a judgment that they can then choose to enforce in some way. And so these conjunctions that Josh was talking about are the most powerful thing. It's not that there's one particular strategy. Insiders versus outsiders debates are very old. The fact is we need both. And we need, in most cases, and figuring out in the local arenas which of these pieces need to be put in place is not something that someone like us, we should not be answering that question. There are people fighting these fights who know the landscape better than we do. There are people who are working in those areas and who are being affected directly by these practices who should be driving that. It's only to say that from where we sit looking at the larger landscape, to recognize that you can't necessarily plug and play what worked there to here, right? A last example of that is there are some issues like asset forfeiture, for example, where social justice organizations on the left have worked very effectively with libertarian organizations on the right. There are others where that's never going to happen. That's just not going to happen. And realizing what kind of issue you're dealing with and what's possible and advantageous is part of the reason why we need really good political analysis.
We got a question from somebody from our Zoom audience. Can you talk about the efficacy of a temporary guaranteed income for people coming home from incarceration? We've seen some great success in Florida interrupting the cycle of poverty and incarceration.
Sure. But first I wanted to say, there's two things I wanted to say about the political struggle part before I answer that. One thing is that you all, and many groups working in this space have really focused on the implementation stage. So often when we're in a political struggle and so people are focusing on passing the policy, getting it done. But that is only the start of another struggle, right? Because so many stuff, once it gets passed, gets subverted, gets rolled back. And the importance of studying how it's being implemented, why it's being implemented, and holding people accountable is absolutely essential. And that's something that we really took away from this work. The other part is just being so impressive, like how long this has been going on. And that change takes a long time, which can lead to some pessimism, but it can also be really optimistic because we see how like each step along the way creates tensions, creates little cracks that, when we get big victories seem like they're these sort of ruptures, but you see over time, it took 25 years for California to move to free phone calls. It took 6 to 8 years for the campaign in Illinois to become the first state to have fully, no cash bail, right? And so I think it's important to keep that in mind, but not in a way to be like, oh, it just takes so long, but to see like all the stuff that's happening on a day-to-day basis is creating this infrastructure that eventually can lead to these big things. Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about the issue, the specific issue. Joe probably knows more, but I think, again, it goes back to what, predation operates on the needs, vulnerabilities, and of individuals, right? To the extent that people have very little, it channels them into predatory relations, right? If you don't have money, you might, if you have a job, you go to payday lending. It forces you into pawn shops, it forces you into things. So if people actually have some resources, then it can mean that they can not be subjected to these things, which, it's not just that that the predatory practices take money at the front, it's that they put people in debt, right? And it's often people that have other sources of debt. And so it hits people into a debt spiral. And so people coming home, we know how critical stability is, right? Having a foundation of having housing, having work, having transportation. And so if you don't have to immediately go into debt and don't have to rely on these kind of companies, then I think that would be right. And again, not just for that person, because it's going to be the mothers, the grandmothers that are put in a position to caring for the person, for paying, housing them, for paying for them. And so I think, so again, this is pure speculation because I haven't, a person who asked the question clearly knows more about this than I do. But I'd say, part of reducing predation is reducing the vulnerabilities of those who get caught up in the arrangement.
And that goes very much with our findings as well. We did a nationally representative survey that's found that more than half the people who owe fines and fees, which is a staggering number of people, are giving up access to a basic necessity in order to pay them off. So if you could actually get people to a place of stability where they could afford their basic necessities, it feels like that would have a really remarkable impact. Swaps.
I just want to add that, so universal basic incomes have many positive features to them. And I think that offering sort of, some form of income support right after the entry would be beneficial in some ways. But I want to mention here that, at the end of the book, in the conclusion, part of what we talk about with the importance of seeing this in terms of the broader storyline of predatory projects and liberal political economy and how they're entwined and all that, is the need to fight these practices and understand these practices in ways that get out of the crime and punishment framework. That we have to understand this as being fundamentally entwined with the struggle for more justice to public finance. Right, that we're funding just like we are funding, universities, not through public, investments anymore so much as, we are investments, but to a much lesser degree, and relying much more on tuition from individual families. individuals, right? We're doing this in this arena as well. We have to understand that you can't change this without fighting the broader fight about justice and public finance. Same way we connected to the issue of reparations. And one of the things that we talk about with reparations, drawing on work both Femi Taiwo and others, is that the idea of simply giving people money as reparations, giving people something, ignores the fact that structurally, if the same systems are in place, it's just going to be taken from them, right? And so part of talking about predatory practices here is to say, yes, that absolutely would be helpful to give people money when they leave. But if they're being burdened with incredible debts when they leave prison, right? If they're in a community where they're being subjected to all kinds of predatory operations, business models, if they never get quite free of the system and there's more fees and fines coming at them, then that money soon will disappear and not toward the things we know they need to spend it on, right? And so if the money is helpful, it certainly is not sufficient on its own to get us where we want to go. So it needs to be there as part of a broader package of policy changes.
And I'll just say, the last quote in the book is from Joanna, who is making the point about public finance, because she's giving testimony. I'm not going to remember the details, but she's giving testimony. It's not about a criminal justice issue. It's about, I think, a tax change or something.
Yeah, about property tax caps.
Yeah. And that's what, so we found this so powerful because, again, she works in this area on fines and fees, but is out testifying about a property tax. And because it is understanding that if we don't have that money coming in, that they will rely on regressive, which is essentially aggressive taxation through fines and fees. Just to sort of come full circle again.
Yeah, and I think when I read the conclusion and about the different ways that you frame the problem, either from the pluses and minuses of all these different ways of framing fines and fees, whether it's from a punishment, from a predatory nature, at the poverty angle, fairness, equality. You sort of lay out a lot of the strengths and weaknesses, but I think it does come down to this, the saying of there's the only things we can be sure of in life are death and taxes, and we will be taxing people no matter what.
Absolutely.
And the question is how and from where and through where. And I think that one of the exciting things about the book is really explaining this as a system of public finance and all of the systems that are implicated, from policing, from courts, et cetera.
So hi, thank you. What a great talk, and thank you, Joanna, the Fines and Fees Justice Center. I'm David Udell, the National Center for Access to Justice. And I thought it was really interesting to hear you talk about the transition from controlling humans to controlling the money, from convict leasing up through fines and fees. That's always been a gap in my understanding. But I kind of wonder who the bad guys here are. The way that you describe it, there's an alignment of financial interests, and it's just natural that the courts and the prison systems would be used to, it sort of implies there are kickbacks. And I just wondered how, or you say it explicitly, I just wonder about the system and sort of the degree to which it's not just like the evil sheriff who's pocketing money, but it's also the judiciary, or it's also the municipal government, or it's also the state government. And it's tempting to say it's just all of them. But I wonder if you have a way to sort of disaggregate that a little and help us understand who's really driving this and when and where, what era even it might have changed over the
That's such a great question, and I'm so glad you asked it. As you say, we're not interested in identifying predators as particular types of people. We're interested in explaining how these practices came to be. And so the question for us is, who are the actors here in many ways? And part of what's important to understand is, well, at one level, the actors are the people during the Reagan administration who, cut back dramatically on federal transfers down to states, and then states down to localities, and devolved responsibilities down, and created these long-running structural mismatches between what governments were shouldering and the resources they had to, accomplish those obligations, right? And then people, in a sense, public managers in some cases, There was no piece of legislation that created all this. Nobody envisioned this whole system. It sort of emerged through a variety of smaller decisions in lots of places and institutions. And usually by in many cases by people who are trying to keep the lights on in public agencies, who sort of saw virtue meeting necessity. In some cases, they were saying, hey, we can get tougher on crime with these, larger fines, with bigger bail amounts. We can protect public safety. We can shield the community from higher taxes. We can sort of win-win-win in various ways for people who were thinking about, trying to run their operations and didn't have enough resources to it. On the other hand, you also had a variety of people who very specifically saw themselves as we want to put personal responsibility on quote unquote criminals. We believe they should be shouldering the burdens for this, not the good citizens. And they were doing it for that reason. You had simple people who wanted to make profits and got involved because this was profitable. Hey, we can get in and do banking in prisons. We can get in and provide telecom services, whatever it is. There's tremendous opportunities. So there's all of these different things. Whether you personally or I personally want to label these bad guys, in a sense, for us is an important question in our own lives. But in the context of the book, it's not our purpose. It's about understanding who did what and what their actual rationales were. Sometimes public, sometimes shared more privately, but to the extent that we can access them, understanding what the agendas were.
If I could just ask a quick follow-up. So is there lobbying at the state and local level and also the courts and so it's the prison industrial complex, or who's doing all that work to keep all this in place?
I mean, because there are these crises, right? Again, it's not a story of conspiracy. It's largely a story of crises that are made through politics and policies. And so as as the system actors become dependent on it, sometimes they're the ones that are clamoring for it, not because they, have like really bad intentions, because they're like, we have to keep the lights on. We have to actually be able to, to be able to go through these cases as judges, right? But there are interests that are pushing this in particular ways, right? And so often when people talk in this area, they talk about privatization, right? Often it's a story about contracting out, right? So prisons become overcrowded, so they contract out to the private companies, right? But the story is more complicated than that. It is a public-private partnership, but often there are people that are interested in making money that are pushing the system in certain ways that will allow them to continue to make money, whether it be encouraging a local jail to get rid of in-face visiting so that they can have, private visitation. Whether it be the bail bond company coming to the state and saying, hey, how about we reformulate probation so it operates like bail. So you actually have to pay it. And so and then coming together and saying, hey, we'll give you commissions, we'll give you a percentage of the profit. So let's keep the rates high, because then you're getting a good portion back. And so there's at that level, right, trying to shape how things operate in the system that is conducive to profit making. And there's absolutely the lobbying, the campaign contributions, just straight up, and getting people to make decisions that are in your interest. So it's not just about the state doing things and then having crises and saying we need to turn to private interests to sort of help us. The private interests are also very involved in shaping the system in ways that increase the reliance of the state on the private companies, just as in the immigration space, similar things are happening.
I want to thank everyone from our Zoom audience. I know that we're just running a little bit over time, and thank you all. We're going to continue the conversation locally, so please don't anyone feel like they need to get up and leave. But thank you both so much for joining us and for this fascinating conversation that I'm looking forward to continuing, not just now, but going forward.
Thank you. Thank you all.